This episode is brought to you by Titus Talent Strategies. Titus was born out of frustration with the traditional recruiting model and a passion for a better way to do business. They took the traditional recruiting model and flipped it on its head. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Coaching for Coaches. Today, we are kicking off with the show's first episode. We are honored to have Lyssa deHart, licensed social worker, master certified coach, board certified coach on the show today. A little bit about Lyssa. She is a supervisor, a mentor to professional coaches all around the world. She is also the author of 2 books. Number 1, StoryJacking, Change Your Inner Dialogue, Transform Your Life. You can find it on Amazon, link below. The second one is The Reflective Coach, a 12-month journal of discovery, also on Amazon. You can find that in the link below. In this episode, we will be talking about essential components of coaching maturity. We'll be conversing about the coaching competencies, and how coaching competencies are expressed in different stages of the journey of maturity, metaphors in coaching, and many other cool things. So without further ado, let's bring on Lyssa deHart.
Hi there. Nice to be here.
Awesome. Well, thank you for being here today. And let me just make a couple of adjustments here just for a second. Doom. Here we are. All right. So just a little bit, I already gave that introduction so that everybody knows. All the links to all of Lyssa's online presence is in the description. And just, both of us are coaches. So I'm going to kick off the show by having a coachy question. Is that
okay? Right? Yes, you do.
All right, go ahead. So if by the end of this show you felt it was amazing, how could we start exploring the topic of the essential components of coaching maturity?
Oh, that's an interesting question. It puts me on the spot here to figure out where to begin. Nicely done there, Roberto. I think it's really, if we were to have a successful conversation, I think we would have really explored and had fun looking at coaching in general. That would be what would make it successful to me.
Awesome. Well, let's explore and have fun then. Those are the 2 parameters for today.
Yes.
All right. So, all right. I'll ask the first question here. When it comes to this coaching maturity, what role do the competencies play in those stages of development?
I've been using an idea lately with people when I'm thinking about the competencies in general. I think a lot of people, and I may be presuming something, so I could be wrong for a lot of people, but I think a lot of people look at the competencies as these sort of check boxes that need to be checked off in order to get your ACC. You need to deepen them a bit in order to get to your PCC. And then you have to deepen them a whole bunch of bits in order to get to your MCC. And I think that that's a very simple way of looking at the competencies. I think when I look at the competencies today, what I'm struck by is the way that the competencies actually create a container. And that it's not that they're a checkbox, but rather they are a way of being present with another human being that makes coaching different than, say, counseling or managing or mentoring or teaching or whatever other whatever other role you might be playing. So for instance, a consultant might come in and they don't need the competencies, because what they're doing is they're coming in as an expert. They're going to listen to your stuff. They're going to assess your, challenge, and then they're going to give you a formula or a prescription, if you will, for how to solve your problem. Whereas the competencies really, if you dive into them, are the exploration of how we are being with another person, that brings out that person's internal awareness, their genius, seeing them as whole, capable, resourceful, and creative, right? And that is a very different lens in which to have a conversation.
Right. And when it comes to coaching in itself, for example, along those lines, I know that, for example, you've assessed people to move on from one stage to a second stage, and for example, the ICF from ACC to PCC. Like, what do you notice is the difference when you hear a recording of an ACC or a PCC with regards to maturity?
Well, I mean, maturity is a really interesting word. So, for the purpose of this conversation, I guess what I'm taking it to mean is a comfort level with utilizing the competencies with confidence. And it's sort of, I don't know, I come from an art background. I had my undergraduate was in fine arts, so I spent a lot of time learning how to look at things, how to draw things, how to see things three-dimensionally. And there were these very basic fundamentals that were required. And if you look at any of the great masters, somebody like, say, Picasso, you look at his very early works, it's very traditional looking art for his time. He learned all the fundamentals before he could really start to break out of the fundamentals and play with something like, cubism or any of the other ways that he showed up as a painter. And I think the same thing is true of coaching. In fact, I was just having this conversation with Tony Latimer a couple nights ago, and we were talking about this idea of getting, you go through in karate, I'm not a karate artist, so I don't know all the stages, but let's say you start off with like a white belt, right? And maybe move to yellow and then green and blue, and I don't know all the different colors. But when you finally get to black belt and you're invited into the black belt group, there's still 8 levels of black belt above you, right? And it's sort of the same thing in coaching, right? Like there's all of these sorts of developmental stages that a human being is going to go through as they learn to deal with the fundamentals, like learning their stances. They're learning however it is that they need to move in karate or in painting or in anything that you choose to learn to become masterful at. It could be painting motorcycles or doing woodworking or being a coach, right? Or being anything. It's those developmental stages, and even the masters continue to develop and work and grow. And so I think that maturity may come in the mindset of it's not a destination, but it is a continual journey of learning that one goes through as a coach to continue to develop oneself. And I remember I was a therapist prior to being a coach, and I remember being in a training for relationship work training that I was in. And I remember just like being like, oh my gosh, I missed so much stuff. I wish I knew yesterday what I now know today. And the person facilitating that training said something really profound, important to me. She said, if you're not a better insert here, therapist, coach, karate expert, if you're not better today than you were yesterday, you're not journeying in the right direction, right? You're maybe stagnating or slipping backwards into easier habits.
I've heard a lot about, for example, this is also true in therapy, and I know that you've done therapy before you became a coach, that you can be the amount of times you actually practice, right, as a practitioner doesn't necessarily equate to more maturity in your practice or being more masterful, because I know there's these two terms, mastery and maturity. What would you say to that? to what it really takes to evolve as a practitioner?
Yeah, well, I would ask the question of, think of anything that you absolutely love deeply, whatever that thing is. I don't care if it's, again, it could be, karate, it could be gardening, it could be anything. I was actually listening to, what's the singer's name? He's awesome, and I can't remember his name right this second. It's very frustrating. But, one of the things that he was saying is, even though he's now this really celebrated singer and he's incredibly well known and very, very good at his craft, if you listen to his very first song and he shared it, and it was probably sounded like me singing, right? It was not that great.
Right.
And I am not a great singer by any means. And it's that sense of putting in the time and energy, working through the discomfort of not being perfect, right? Like all those things that are required in order to move through those different developmental stages. And
Right.
I mean, that's going to be so dependent on the person standing in front of you as you're talking about this. And in my mind, it also comes with that mindset of this isn't something that when I don't like how it goes, or I'm not perfect, or I listen to my questions and I'm like cringing and I don't want to, I just want to do it the way I'm comfortable doing it. I don't want to learn a new way of doing it. That instead I move through that discomfort and I get to the other side. And I think that's a bit of the maturity also, is to not just give up as soon as we don't like the outcome.
The outcome. And I remember it took me quite a while. I've got, well, I'll say it, but I think I submitted like 4 or 6 different times for my PCC. Failed. And that was a hard process to go through, the fact of like, you're not there yet, and persisting, right? So I think, I think constant learning opportunities instead of failure, I think, is also important for mastery and maturity along anything. Right.
Yeah, I have a client who was in his PhD program, and they asked all the participants of this program to write their failure resume and to just really start to write down every failure they've had. And then instead of like what their job title or their job description was, they wrote down everything they learned from that failure. And I think back, I had just gotten my MCC on a Wednesday. This was in November 2018. I got my MCC on a Wednesday, and on Saturday I'm going into this live fishbowl event where I'm going to be observed coaching, and I'm going to have I think there were 100 people there. So about, 200 eyeballs staring at whatever I'm doing. And then there was a row of master coaches who were going to assess my coaching in front of everybody. And yeah, and the conversation, I will say, did not go so well. I got into a loop. I think I was overwhelmed by the number of eyeballs. The client was not ready to share. I think she was maybe overwhelmed, I'm guessing, on her part. But it did not go so well. And somebody who I respect so highly, Fran Fisher, I went up to her afterwards because she was one of the people observing the coaching. And I said, "Oh God, that felt so hard. That isn't how I normally coach." And she goes, "It's okay, Lyssa. Everybody bombs sometimes." I was like, "What? I bombed?"
Like comedians, right?
Like comedians, yeah. And I think we have to just learn to take it a bit with a grain of salt. Like, nobody died. I learned a ton from that. I learned so much about being in that place of discomfort and what kind of question might come out of that place that's much more transparent. Like, "Hey, client, I'm noticing that I feel like we're running around in a circle, and I'm curious how this impacts what you say is important to you. Like, how does this land on you as you hear me say that?" Versus trying to ask another good question or right question about what do you want to have by the end of today. Maybe get curious about the experience you're having, which I, hadn't been in that position before. So it was that bombing that actually led to that awareness.
Of course. And I'm going to weave this into your 2 books, because I like the flow of the conversation. At the beginning, it's always but now I think we're getting into flow, and I'm going to throw away most of the questions I had.
Okay, that's fine.
Different
off-road.
Off-road, and speaking to the let's have fun and explore, right? So I'm trying to, keep to that. But number one, so I've bombed lots of times. And I think, and I'm going to weave this into supervision and mentoring in your two books eventually. So what I'm getting at here is I also read to the fact that there's a difference between ACC, PCC, and MCC is, for example, from PCC to MCC is the continuum of the importance of formulaicness, being formulaic, right? At the beginning, you try to be really formulaic with your questions and this and that. And as you go along in PCC, you're still a little bit concerned about your own performance, right? Instead of showing up fully in presence. And I've heard, and I've also heard MCC's coach, it's more of a dance. It's more of a very fluid dance in the conversation. And it's more about whatever is occurring there, right? And what would you speak to that? What that's what I've experienced and heard people say.
I mean, that's I think a pretty good explanation. I think there's a real deepening of the partnership. And when you think about deepening of trust and safety, if you think about deepening of coaching presence and partnership with the client, and our questions being geared towards client insight and not coach insight, these are the things that we're really looking at when you're moving towards an MCC coach. And it's not that it is that there aren't questions that are there, like what's really showing up as important today to have a conversation about. That's probably still going to show up even in an MCC conversation. The difference is that MCC may hear things that the client is saying in the first 5 minutes that the ACC or even the new PCC may not have heard. And so they're going to probably go much more directly to the deeper, more important underlying issue. I think another thing that happens, in fact, I'm listening to PCC assessments right now. And one of the things that I see is that a lot of people, especially early in their coaching, because their desire is to be of value to the client, they want to demonstrate their value. They want to get that client someplace, that what they tend to do is their questions lean towards the situation versus the client's relationship to the situation. And that's a bit of that partnership also, because if I'm trying to get you somewhere, I'm leading you somewhere. I am not being led by you. That is not a partnership. And when coaching is thinking of partnership, and when you're looking at the competencies in partnership, you start looking at the markers, and you see things like question had the capacity to teach it open up the client to self-awareness in some way. Maybe they're recognizing how they're perceiving the world, or they're getting curious about the words that they're sharing, or they're getting curious about, like, you say something and I hear like the little laugh in your voice that might sound kind of nervous, like nervous laughter, or it might sound like, true laughter. Like, but I'm testing hypotheses as an MCC. I'm not assuming I know what that means. So I'm like, hey, I noticed there was a little lilt in your voice as you said that. I'm curious what's showing up for you. Again, the client now is getting out of the habitual way that they show up. And now they're like, I'm noticing that I'm kind of giggling a little bit, but it's kind of a nervous giggle. What's that nervousness about? That would be useful for us to explore. And now we're into the real meat of it, because we're not ever going to make the manager be different, or the client if they're in sales, the client that they're working with be different, or the situation that happened in the past. I mean, I don't have Mr. Peabody's way back machine, so we're not going back in time to do a do-over on it, right? So yeah, that's an old one. My husband gave that to me many years ago, and I've always loved that idea of Mr. Peabody's way back machine. But I think we sometimes, and so I think it's that sense of just being in the moment, and to your point, in that dance and in the flow with the client where they are, but hearing things that aren't just the situation. So, like, for instance, in an example of this, the client says something and the coach's response to that is, how would you do this situation differently next time, versus a question that might sound much more like, what did you discover as you reflect back on that? Right. Two very different directions.
Right. And I think you said it about assuming and assumptions. You're like, I hear something, or the coach hears something that may have more maturity, or is a master coach or master level coach, and they may not even create a hypothesis and just be curious about it. And that's going to go back to, I'm going to connect this to your book, StoryJacking. So,
Okay.
tell me about the title, StoryJack. What does StoryJacking mean? Just those
Okay. So
composite word.
So that book I published in 2017, and that really came out of the work that I had been doing as a therapist, and then as I was becoming a coach. So I got my original coach training in 2008, but I didn't apply for my ACC until 2014. And then in 2016, I applied for my PCC, and then in 2018, I applied for my MCC. So I sort of had a pretty quick trajectory there on the developmental steps of coaching. But that book really came out of the exploration of the neuroscience of like how we create stories in our mind about everything. And those stories may or may not be true relative to what is truth, right? It can be multiple things. And how we attach ourselves to those stories, whether those stories are useful or not, we may not really question them very much. And so I took this idea of jacking as not like hijacking something, although I do believe our stories can hijack us. It's more about like shifting, like you elevate a car, you jack it up in order to change a tire, right? Or you question something and you basically come up with a new perspective that might be more useful. And so it's much more about the jacking of our own stories, like getting curious about them, maybe taking the wheels off the car, so to speak, and changing our tires on how we're moving through our life. And if it's working for us, great, like keep doing what you're doing. But if you've got a place where you're not getting the outcome that you want, it often has to do with the way that you're thinking about things. And I mean, this is really Stoicism at its core. And my husband loves Stoicism, and I really like Stoicism. And so we were having a conversation, and I'm like, as we were having this conversation, I'm like, it's like we need to really jack our stories, and and he's like, you need to write that down. And I'm like, I do need to write that down. And so hence StoryJacking came out of that conversation. That was back in 2016.
In 2016. And in that sense, do you feel that this, how could this book help coaches in session to become more masterful and increase their maturity?
Well, I mean, it wasn't written for coaches specifically. I mean, it was really much more written for the human being on the other side of it. I think that anytime coaches are doing their own work and starting to look at their own stories and starting to look at their own self-awareness, they become better coaches. And I mean, I've had this conversation on my podcast quite a few times with people. It is very hard to hold the space for another human being going through something that we ourselves are uncomfortable going through. So as soon as something comes up that I'm not comfortable with, and I'm going to make this up because I'm very comfortable with emotions, but let's just say the client starts to cry about something. And I've heard this from other coaches, like, what do you do when emotions get really, really strong? Well, for me, I get curious. I think emotions are just telling us something. But for another coach who's maybe like, I grew up in a culture where I'm not allowed to cry, and that could be like maybe my parents, I don't know. I grew up in Texas, so like maybe cowboys don't cry, right? Like, so you got the John Wayne thinking going on. And so if I'm uncomfortable with the crying, I may try and either save the client and be like, oh, you don't need to feel so bad about that. Everybody feels that way. It's okay. You're going to be fine. And we become a cheerleader to try and lift them up, or we just like walk right past it. Like, I do not even see crying. I'm just going to leave that alone because I don't even want it. That's therapy. Versus just being curious. Like, what does the crying tell you in this moment about what's showing up for you? Which is a different place. But if I hadn't become comfortable with my own emotional spectrum, right? Yeah. It's going to be very difficult for me to hold that space for another person without interjecting my own stuff onto it. And that's a lot about maturity at that point also. How do we differentiate ourselves from our clients and from our own experiences. And even though I might be crying for a very different reason than maybe the client is crying, I don't know unless I ask.
Sure. And I was thinking in the sense of, because I'll make this, let's say, note here. When I've recently that I've been coaching, I've been noticing my own internal dialogue, like the way I'm thinking about the session and myself, or whatever I may be going through in the session, outside of the session, everything, right? And sometimes I find myself that becomes distracting. That's inner noise. Could you speak to how a coach can work with that in a session so it doesn't diminish their presence?
That is the work of supervision. And that is really where coaching supervision comes in. Honestly, I'm a big advocate of supervision. I've been in supervision since 1992 in one form or another. And I just happen to have it here, my book, The Reflective Coach. But what you start to do is you start to get curious. So for instance, like this is a chapter on transference. And so it talks a little bit about transference. But what you do is you write down that client situation. You write it as fully as you can. And then you start asking yourself some questions about like what just happened. What transference just happened there? And so an example of transference might be, let's say that you remind me of my nephew. And I want the best for my nephew. And you're telling me about this really hard situation. And all of a sudden I become your aunt and I'm talking to you from the place of your aunt. Like, Roberto, you can do this and you've got all the skills and I don't understand why you don't trust yourself. You should trust yourself, right? Like, and so now I've transferred my nephew onto you. You might be doing the same thing to me. As soon as I do that, it might put you in a position of being like this kid to their aunt, right? And so it starts to go into that idea, those ideas of transactional analysis, right? How do we both show up as adults? How does the coach stay in the role of adult with an adult client, or even, expert novice? Like, how does the coach give up the role of expertise to tell the client what they need to do and instead maybe shift into the role of novice and be taught by the client something, right? And these are things that we start to explore. And so I think one of the ways that we start to do that with our work is that we are in a process like coaching supervision so that we can really start to explore our own self-awareness. Like, what just happened when that emotion showed up and I was like, not doing it? Like, what was that about for me? What just happened there?
So that's a way to really clean up your coaching in that sense. To not let it, well, I'm going to use this word, it might not be the best, but you don't contaminate, or contaminate it as least possible.
Yeah, you keep it as clean as you can.
As clean as possible, so that all those in the transference and all those things don't come up. And what would you say is the difference between working in supervision and mentoring with a coach?
So mentoring is typically very specific to your capacity to understand and use the competencies. It is very much directed towards well, for ACCs, it may also be directed towards renewal of your certification if you're an ACC, but everybody's got to have 10 hours of mentor coaching to apply for their ACC. They're going to need another 10 hours to apply for their PCC, and they're going to need another 10 hours to apply for their MCC. And it is typically very much about how the competencies are being demonstrated through the questions. So for instance, if I ask a question like, so, I mean, I'm hearing you, Roberto, have this awareness and insight, and it sounds like you're really having some really deep awareness about this situation. Am I reading that right? And you go, yes or no, right? Like, it's probably a pretty closed-ended question. There's not very many competencies that are going to be demonstrated by that question, right?
I see.
So in mentor coaching, you're gonna hear that question and you're gonna talk to the coach about, like, what other choice points did you have here? How might you have structured that question in a way that would have been more useful to the client awareness, such as, Roberto, I noticed what sounded like a shift to me. I could be wrong, but could you tell me a little bit about what's showing up for you as you hear yourself say that? Now, all of a sudden, you've got to start to make meaning out of what just happened. And we're hitting competencies around trust and safety. We're hitting competencies around coaching presence, around questions, or evoking awareness. I mean, listening, it's all there. Like all the different competencies start to get met by a very simple question change, right? So that's mentor coaching. Coaching supervision is much more about your relationship to the work that you're doing.
So about me, about the self, who I am, who I'm being, right?
Who you are being,
and how that shows up.
Exactly. And so, we work with corporate clients. Sometimes there's things where we have maybe our agreements aren't very clear, and somebody's coming to us in an organization, but we have to also be able to talk to their manager, and we're looking at issues of like ethics. We're looking at issues of like where people feel uncomfortable. Maybe you have the client, I don't know, raise your hand if you've never had this client who maybe wears you out and you're exhausted at the end of the session, right? That would be a great client to get curious about, like, what's happening there that I'm so tired. Right. Guessing from past experience of my own, I'm probably working way harder than the client, and the client is going, yeah, but I don't think that'll work. Yeah, but I don't like that idea. And so the coach is like going through all these like different little dance moves in order to try and
try to get the client results, to try to to achieve the outcome or whatever the striving that the coach may have. And well, that's related to your book, the one you just showed us, right? So you can find all that information below to get it on Kindle or physical via Amazon.
I think it's a journal, so this one's only physical.
It's only physical. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So now, going to your podcast, can you talk to us a little bit about your podcast?
Yeah. So I during COVID, I was spending a lot more time on LinkedIn than I had previously. And so when it started, when the lockdown started in 2020, and I was spending time on LinkedIn, I was just reaching out to people I was connected to or wanted to be connected to. And I was having these really interesting conversations with them. And I'm like, why am I not recording these conversations? And so that was sort of the impetus for me in wanting to do a podcast. I had done a couple of podcasts before this one. The first one was called The 1 Minute Mindset, and it was back in 2009, 2010. And it was incredibly hard work because it takes a lot of work to just say something useful in 1 minute or so. And so I couldn't keep that up. It was just too much work for me. So I only did a few of those episodes. And then the second podcast that I did was after I came out with StoryJacking, and I interviewed people about their own jacking of their own stories and what that looked like. But those were like, they needed a lot of editing because people could really talk a lot and maybe not say all that much that was super important, but like gave a lot of context. And so that wasn't really sustainable either. But what I discovered in this podcast by doing these interviews, sort of like you're doing, there was much more of an interaction that was happening, and it was fun. Yeah. And I didn't have to edit. Yeah, exactly. And I didn't have to edit it to the same degree. So I decided to do the podcast. Well, lo and behold, and I thought I was the only one. So and I even did some going out and typing it up, and I couldn't find any other podcasts that were really doing what I was doing. Lo and behold, Mel Liao was doing one that he had just started about 3 months before, 3 or 4 months before me. Yeah, no, Mel is awesome. He's going to be awesome, he's going to be on my podcast in October. It's his birthday month. Cool. And then the other person that was doing the similar sort of thing was Gideon Coleman. And so as soon as, of course, I start publishing, I realize that Mel is doing this. And then there's also this guy, Gideon, who's doing it too. So the three of us got together and we're like, how do we support each other? Because there's plenty of room for all of us to do this. And so, I mean, I highly recommend that if you're going to listen to my podcast, go listen to 100 Master Coaches. And Gideon's podcast is Masterful Coaching, I think, but I could be getting that wrong. I've slept since
Definitely go check
but
out those.
Gideon's got a great podcast, and all three of us have very different styles. And I know there's going to be a new podcast coming out with Tracy Sinclair. She's got another podcast coming out that's going to be talking to coaches also.
Sure. And well, I'm going to be having Mel on as well. And I'm going to be I'll reach out to Tracy and Gideon. Maybe they want to be here on the show, because this show in itself is bringing people from the world of professional development for coaches and business development like yourself to talk about these things. So, as we wrap up, could you tell me a little bit about metaphors? Because I wanted to ask you about that, and you have something coming up related to metaphors in coaching.
Yeah. So one of the things that has always been really interesting to me, and part of the reason I even went into the field that I went into, from art into social work and then ultimately into coaching, was this idea of how the mind and how the brain works. And so I spent a lot of time when I was a therapist learning a lot about trauma, and I was my focus was PTSD, complex trauma, and dissociative disorders. And so I took a lot of coursework and continuing education around how the brain works as a result of that. And when I went into coaching, one of the things that I really appreciated was some of the work that David Rock was doing in the middle 2000s, where he was looking at the neuroscience and the neuro leadership program is what he calls it now. It started off as results coaching, but I went through his program and I liked the idea of it, but I realized that there was just a lot more to it than just the neuroscience of how the competencies hold a container of a conversation. And so as I was exploring this, one of the things that showed up was this linguistical thing, this creative linguistical idea containers that people were utilizing as they talked about complex ideas in the way that they were discussing their life, their situation, whatever it was. And I wondered more about that. And so I started doing research on this back in 2000 and probably 2017, 2018. I really started to pay attention to this. And I've been doing a lot of research since then. And so I've come up with a certification program on using metaphors more consciously with our clients, but not with the coach giving the metaphor, which is, I think, what a lot of programs really talk about, is like, how do you create the metaphor, because it's such a great creative way to talk about an issue, but rather, how do you listen for the metaphors that the client naturally brings forward? Because the neuroscience of that is that there are conceptual metaphors that light up different regions of the brain. And I have just done a ton of research on that. And I'm now trying to teach other coaches how to, like there's a lot of really great tools out there. I've been hearing a lot about Lego serious play, where you play with people and metaphors naturally come out of that. I think there is a huge difference, though, of having a tool that you bring into the coaching versus your capacity to listen deeply to the things that show up naturally in a conversation. And it's not that, every client is metaphorically rich. Some clients are, maybe they don't use metaphors quite as often or as obviously, and so you have to really learn to listen deeply to the nuanced metaphors that they use. But it is it's a way of listening and being present with a client that I think is really crucial, and it doesn't require any tools other than you as the coach being the tool.
I read a book, I'm not sure if you're familiar, called Clean Coaching by Angela Dunbar.
Yeah, it's probably a lot of clean language in there. Is that what the book was about?
Clean language? Exactly. That comes from a specific person who worked with that in therapy, and and in the book it talks about metaphorical language, but not coming from the coach, but bringing it out from the client. Right. So I really like that book. Read it a long time ago, but I recall some of what you're saying.
Yeah, clean language is really cool, and I really like clean language. And there's a bit of a structure to clean language that is what I'm doing. This is much more about the structure of how you're listening, because the clients invariably bring forward metaphors that we just don't even think of as metaphors. Like, I really want to lean into this idea of getting feedback. Well, leaning in is a metaphor for moving into a space of, right? And this lights up one of the hemispheres of the brain because it has to do with movement. And so if you know that, you hear lean in and you're like, if you were leaning in and you were doing that the way you wanted to be doing that, what would be different? And now you're starting to create the container of a conversation. And leaning in is important, but a lot of times we hear it, we don't even hear it as a metaphor. We just hear it as, the title of a book.
Right, because it's like it's a figure of speech, so we don't see the figurativeness of it in the metaphor aspect. Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. Well, tell us when that's coming out, when people can go and get that with you, whatever that may be.
Yeah, so the program is a certification program. It's a level 1 certification program, and it is going to be starting in like 2 weeks. So there's only 2 more weeks to sign up for it. It is called the Power of Metaphor Certification Program. So it's available on my website, and I'll give you the link and you can share it.
Yeah. I saw that on your website. Tell us more about what's available on your website so that coaches can improve their journey of professional development.
So I have on my website, I have a YouTube channel, and in the YouTube channel, I have coaching demonstrations, and those coaching demonstrations really also have the markers. I stop every time I ask a question and kind of like go through what markers might be demonstrated by that particular question. It's also available without the markers, with the transcript and with the debrief on my website. And that's free to people to go and just go, and you can watch all the videos. I also have things like 8 common coaching mistakes where you can start to look at like telling versus asking. Why am I talking? The weight methodology of like, why am I doing this? Why does my mouth keep moving? So there's lots of different resources that I have available. I also have mentor coaching groups that are upcoming, and one-on-one mentoring. Coaching supervision is something I do not off the website, but more one-on-one, or creating groups of coaches who are like, hey, we want to do a coaching supervision group together. And it's like, great, let's pull together this group, and then we do the group. So
great. So you can get all those things going to your website, and they'll be able to see all that information below and connect with you on all your social media channels. And obviously that level 1 course, which I may be interested in. That seems super cool. So I'll get in touch with you after the show about that. And aside from that, we have that question, right? What is an amazing but true fact about you that you want to share? Remember that when we asked you that?
Oh, an amazing but true fact about me. Well, an amazing but true fact about me is that I like to do home projects, and so right now my husband and I are in the middle of renovating our house, and I'll just turn my camera around, but we learned how to rough in a new door, so you can kind of see. So an amazing but true fact about Lyssa is that I don't mind getting my hands dirty and and doing some construction around the house. I'm a very good tiler, but then there's things I leave to the experts. So we have somebody else installing the flooring and doing electrical stuff.
Putting tiles and all that. Oh Lord, that's not as easy as one would think, right?
No, but I really enjoy doing it. So it's something you wouldn't just know about me.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for being here on the show today. We let it go because it's 44 minutes. It's been a
holy cow.
Hey, I had fun. How about you? How's your experience?
It was great. This was very fun. I'm really glad that you invited me. Thank you so much for inviting me to do this with you.
Well, thank you very much. All right, everybody, be well. Goodbye, Lyssa, and welcome back. You're welcome to the show again whenever you wish. Okay?
Thank you.
All right. Be well. Take care. All right, everybody. Well, thank you very much for tuning in today. Today, we talked about the essential Components of Coaching Maturity with Lyssa deHart. And, well, thank you for everybody who tuned in right now and who will be tuning in later. You can catch this show on different podcast platforms, live on LinkedIn, live on YouTube, and in my Facebook page, Roberto Jose Vendana. And, well, other than that, thank you very much, and see you soon in the next one.